The sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting fragmented patterns of deep reds and blues on the church pews. I sat in the second row, fidgeting with the hem of my sweater, trying to calm the storm inside me. St. Michael's had always been my place of refuge, but today it felt suffocating. My husband Greg was away again, off on another business trip. He'd been gone so much lately that the idea of marriage felt like a fading echo, rather than a shared reality. "Are you staying after Mass?" The voice startled me, soft yet commanding. I looked up to see Father Anthony, his eyes kind and his tone calm, but there was something about the way he studied me that always left me slightly on edge. "Yes, I was hoping to speak with you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. I felt foolish admitting it, but where else could I go? Father Anthony had been a fixture in my life since I was a teenager. My parents revered him, his sermons always striking a balance between compassion and firm discipline. I respected him, maybe even admired him in a way I couldn't fully articulate. He had this air of control, an unshakable presence that felt both comforting and intimidating. "Of course, I'll be in the confessional," he said with a nod, before disappearing toward the altar. The last time I had truly felt connected to Greg was years ago, back when we were still filled with plans and hopes for the future. Marriage was supposed to be a partnership, but somewhere along the way, it became a routine of shared space and distant gazes. I told myself it wasn't anyone's fault, but that didn't stop the ache in my chest from growing deeper each day. After the congregation had thinned out, I made my way to the confessional booth. The air inside was heavy, the faint scent of wood polish mingling with something more elusive, perhaps the weight of countless secrets shared within these walls. I knelt down, waiting for him to open the partition. "Speak freely, child." His voice came through the screen. It was gentle, but there was an authority in it that made my stomach twist. "Father, I've been struggling," I began, my voice trembling. "Greg, my husband, he's so distant. It's like I don't even know him anymore, and I've been questioning myself, my worth, my faith, everything." He didn't respond immediately, and the silence felt oppressive. When he finally spoke, his words were measured, deliberate. "Doubt is natural, especially in marriage. You've committed yourself to a life that demands sacrifice. Tell me, how have you been managing this doubt?" I swallowed hard, the truth sitting heavy on my tongue. "Not well. I feel empty, like there's no one who truly sees me, truly understands me." His sigh was soft but carried weight. "Loneliness is a dangerous companion, my child. It can lead us astray, make us seek solace in places we shouldn't. Have you prayed for guidance?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yes, but it doesn't help. I keep feeling this pull, this need for something more." "Something more?" His voice sharpened slightly, and I felt my cheeks flush. "I don't know what I mean," I stammered, realizing how my words might sound. I feel lost." There was a pause before he spoke again, his tone shifting to something softer, almost personal. "You must resist these thoughts. You are stronger than you believe, but strength requires discipline." "Discipline?" The word hung in the air, weighted with implication. "What do you mean?" I asked cautiously. "We often seek the wrong remedies for our pain. What you need is focus, a commitment to purging these doubts and desires through prayer and acts of devotion. Perhaps you could spend more time here, helping the church, it might offer clarity. The idea unsettled me, but I nodded nonetheless. Thank you, Father. I'll try. As I left the booth, his words echoed in my mind. Was it comfort he was offering? Or was it something else entirely? A test, perhaps, to see how far I was willing to go. That evening, I sat alone at our kitchen table, the silence of the house pressing down on me. Greg's absence felt like a ghost lingering in the room. I glanced at my phone, debating whether to call him, but what would I even say? The distance between us wasn't something a phone call could fix. My thoughts wandered back to Father Anthony. There was something about the way he had spoken to me, the way he had framed my pain as both a test and a weakness. His confidence made me feel both reassured and strangely vulnerable. It was as if he held the answers, and all I needed to do was trust him. The next morning, I found myself back at St. Michael's, cleaning the pews under the pretense of helping the church. Father Anthony was there, of course, overseeing the volunteers. He greeted me warmly, his smile disarming. "I'm glad you decided to come," he said, his voice low but firm. "How are you feeling today?" "A bit better, I suppose," I replied, though the truth was far more complicated. As the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that his eyes lingered on me longer than they should. Every casual comment, every slight gesture seemed loaded with an undertone I couldn't quite name. When he placed his hand briefly on my shoulder to thank me for my help, I felt a jolt of something, an awareness of his presence that left me both flustered and confused. By the end of the day, I was exhausted but restless. Sitting alone in my car, I replayed the moments from the afternoon in my mind. Was I imagining things? Was I reading too much into his words and actions? Or was there something real beneath the surface, something neither of us dared to acknowledge? The questions swirled in my mind as I drove home, the quiet hum of the engine doing little to drown out the storm inside me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel quite so alone. But that realization brought little comfort. If anything, it terrified me. The next few days passed in a haze. My mind kept circling back to that moment in the confessional booth, the sharp, commanding tone of Father Anthony's voice, the strange vulnerability I felt kneeling before him. It haunted me in a way I couldn't quite explain, weaving itself into my thoughts like an uninvited guest. Even in Greg's brief, obligatory phone calls, I struggled to focus, distracted by a mix of guilt and something more insidious. "I miss you," I lied into the receiver, twirling the phone cord around my finger as I sat on the couch. "Miss you too," Greg replied mechanically, his voice flat and distant. He was always preoccupied lately, either with work or the endless travel it required. The warmth and playfulness we used to share had been replaced by rote exchanges, like actors reading from a script. "I'll be home next weekend." "Great," I murmured, not sure if I meant it. Even as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the nagging sensation that had taken root in my chest. A deep, gnawing hunger for something more. My loneliness had become a constant companion, but now it felt as though it had found a voice. A dangerous, magnetic voice that lingered in my thoughts far longer than it should. That Sunday, I found myself back at St. Michael's, my hands clutching the sides of the pew as Father Anthony delivered his sermon. His words were calm and deliberate, yet there was an undercurrent to them that made my pulse quicken. "The path to salvation is not easy," he said, his eyes sweeping over the congregation. When they landed on me, I felt a jolt of awareness, as if he could see straight through me. It requires discipline, sacrifice, a willingness to confront the darkest corners of your soul and bring them to light. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, the memory of his last instructions still fresh in my mind. Had anyone else heard the sharp edge to his words, or was it only me? I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, that I was projecting my own emotions onto him. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. After the service, I lingered in the back of the church, unsure if I should stay or leave. Part of me wanted to flee, to put as much distance between myself and Father Anthony as possible. But another part, a darker, more curious part, needed to stay. "Good morning." His voice startled me, smooth and unhurried. He stood a few feet away, his hands clasped behind his back. "You've been coming to Mass more often. I'm glad to see it." I guess I've needed it," I admitted, feeling my cheeks flush. "It's been a tough time." He nodded, his expression unreadable. "The church is always here for you, as am I, should you need guidance." There it was again, that faint suggestion beneath his words, an offer that felt both comforting and unsettling. I opened my mouth to thank him, but he spoke again before I could. "Why don't you stay for a while? We could talk." It wasn't a question. His tone was soft but firm, leaving little room for refusal. I hesitated, glancing toward the door, but my feet didn't move. "All right," I said quietly. He led me to his office, a small, sparsely furnished room tucked away behind the altar. The air inside was cool and faintly scented with wood polish. He gestured for me to sit, taking a seat across from me behind a heavy oak desk. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of the room pressing down on us. "How are you feeling?" he asked finally, his voice low and measured. "Confused," I admitted. "I don't know how to make sense of everything. My life feels disconnected, like I'm not even part of it anymore." He nodded, leaning forward slightly. "That's not uncommon. Many people feel lost at some point in their lives, but you've taken the first step by seeking guidance. That shows strength." I looked down at my hands, twisting them nervously in my lap. "I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm falling apart." "Then we will rebuild you," he said firmly, his eyes locking onto mine. "But you must be willing to trust me completely." There it was again, that tone, that unspoken undercurrent that left me both reassured and unnerved. I nodded slowly, unsure of what else to do. "What do you need me to do?" I asked hesitantly. He regarded me for a long moment before standing and walking around the desk. He stopped a few feet in front of me, his posture relaxed but commanding. "Kneel," he said simply. My heart jumped at the word, the memory of the confessional booth flooding back. I hesitated, but the look in his eyes left no room for doubt. Slowly, I slid off the chair and onto my knees, the cold hardness of the floor sending a shiver through me. "Good," he murmured, his voice low and almost hypnotic. "Close your eyes." I obeyed, my breath coming in shallow bursts as the room seemed to shrink around me. His presence felt overwhelming, his voice wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. "You are here because you seek clarity," he said, his tone soft but firm, "because you want to let go of the things that weigh you down. Isn't that right?" "Yes," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Then you must surrender to the process," he continued, "to my guidance. Do you trust me?" "Yes," I said again, though the word felt foreign on my tongue. Good, he said. I felt him step closer, his shadow falling over me like a shroud. Now repeat after me. I am ready to be free of my burdens. I am ready to be free of my burdens, I repeated, my voice trembling. I will trust in the guidance of those who lead me. I will trust in the guidance of those who lead me. You are stronger than you believe, he said, his voice softer now. And together, we will make you whole again. As I knelt there repeating his words, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. There was a power in his voice, in his presence that seemed to seep into my very bones. It was intoxicating, and it terrified me. When he finally allowed me to rise, my legs were shaky and my heart was pounding. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch lingering just a moment too long. You've made progress today, he said, his tone warm and reassuring. But there is still work to be done. I nodded, unable to meet his gaze. As I left his office, the weight of his words followed me, lingering in the air like an unspoken promise. The days following my last meeting with Father Anthony were a blur of conflicting emotions. On one hand, I felt a strange sense of clarity. His words, his presence, had awakened something in me. On the other, the nature of that awakening left me unsettled, questioning whether I was walking the right path or teetering on the edge of something far more dangerous. Greg returned home late Friday night, his suitcase dragging behind him as he entered the house with the detached wariness I'd grown used to. He kissed me on the cheek, a perfunctory gesture, before heading straight for the bedroom. No, I missed you. No shared stories about our time apart. Just silence. By the time I crawled into bed beside him, he was already asleep, his back turned to me. I stared at the ceiling, the dull hum of his breathing blending with the quiet of the room. The weight of his indifference pressed down on me, suffocating in its banality. It wasn't just loneliness I felt. It was invisibility. And the only person who seemed to notice me lately wasn't the man I had vowed to spend my life with. The next morning, I found myself drawn to St. Michael's again, as if on autopilot. I told Greg I had errands to run, and he barely looked up from his laptop to acknowledge me. The drive to the church was filled with nervous energy, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly as I tried to calm the storm brewing inside me. When I arrived, the church was quiet, its usual congregation absent in the early hours. Father Anthony was in the back, overseeing some of the younger volunteers as they polished the pews. He looked up when I entered, his expression softening as he noticed me. "You're here early," he said, setting down the cloth he'd been holding. His tone was light, almost teasing, but there was something deeper beneath it, an unspoken understanding that both comforted and unnerved me. "I needed some time to think," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, gesturing toward the front of the church. "Let's talk." I followed him, the weight of his presence pulling me forward like a magnet. He led me to the small alcove near the altar, a space often used for private prayer. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows painted the walls in a kaleidoscope of colors, casting a surreal glow over the room. "What's on your mind?" he asked, his voice soft but probing. I hesitated, unsure of how to articulate the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "I just feel disconnected," I admitted finally. "From Greg, from myself, from everything. And being here, being around you, It's the only place I feel seen. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something unspoken, something dangerous. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual calm demeanor. "You're not alone in feeling that way," he said. "Many people struggle with the weight of their lives, especially when they feel unappreciated or unseen. It's human nature to crave connection, to want to feel valued." "But it feels wrong," I confessed, my voice trembling. "These thoughts I've been having, they're not right. They're not pure." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. "What makes you think they're wrong?" "Because they're not about Greg," I blurted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Silence fell between us, heavy and suffocating. I half expected him to recoil, to chastise me for my confession, but instead, he remained calm, his expression unreadable. "Temptation is a powerful force," he said finally, "but it's not inherently sinful. What matters is how we respond to it." His words sent a shiver through me, their meaning as ambiguous as his tone. Was he offering me absolution? Or was he testing me, waiting to see how far I would go? "I don't know how to respond," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel so lost." "Then let me help you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But you must trust me completely. Can you do that?" I nodded, though the knot in my stomach warned me I was venturing into dangerous territory. "Good," he said, standing and extending a hand to me. "Come with me." He led me to his office, the door clicking shut behind us as we stepped inside. The air in the room felt heavier than usual, charged with an energy I couldn't quite define. He gestured for me to sit, but instead of taking his usual place behind the desk, he remained standing, leaning against the edge of the table as he studied me. "You carry a lot of guilt," he said after a moment. "Guilt for feeling things you think you shouldn't. Guilt for wanting more than what you have. But guilt can be a tool, a way to confront the truth about yourself." "What truth?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "That you're human," he said simply. "Flawed, vulnerable, and in need of connection. There's no shame in that." His words wrapped around me like a cocoon, equal parts comforting and suffocating. I felt myself leaning into his presence, craving the solace he seemed to offer, even as a small voice in the back of my mind screamed for me to pull away. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward my hands which were clenched tightly in my lap. I nodded, unsure of what I was agreeing to. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine as he gently prized them apart. His touch was warm, his grip firm yet tender. "You need to let go," he said, his voice low and steady, "of your fear, your guilt, your doubt. Only then can you find peace." I nodded again, though my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. His hands lingered on mine for a moment longer before he released me, stepping back with a measured grace that felt almost calculated. This is a process," he said, his tone returning to its usual calm authority. "It won't happen overnight, but if you're willing to commit to it, I'll guide you every step of the way." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy cloak. "I am," I said finally, though the tremor in my voice betrayed my uncertainty. "Good," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Then let's begin?" As I left the office, my thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and longing. His words, his touch, his presence, it all felt too much, too consuming. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. There was a gravity to him that held me in place, pulling me closer even as my instincts screamed for me to run. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive, but at what cost? The days that followed my meeting with Father Anthony were a storm of conflicting emotions. His words replayed in my mind, their weight far greater than I had anticipated. Let go of your guilt, your fear, your doubt. But what exactly did that mean? And why did it feel as though he was talking about more than just my struggles with Greg? Greg's presence at home did little to alleviate the tension I carried. He was there, physically at least, but it was as though we were living in parallel worlds. I tried to bridge the gap, suggesting we have dinner together or watch a movie like we used to, but his responses were mechanical, almost indifferent. I'm exhausted. Maybe another time, he muttered one evening before disappearing into the office, leaving me alone at the kitchen table. The clinking of my wine glass against the wood was the only sound that filled the silence. It wasn't just the absence of love, it was the absence of acknowledgement. I felt invisible, a ghost drifting through our marriage, and the weight of it was unbearable. But when I thought of Father Anthony, a flicker of something, light, warmth, recognition, sparked within me. On Wednesday evening, I returned to St. Michael's. The church was empty except for Father Anthony, who was lighting candles near the altar. The soft glow of the flames cast flickering shadows across his face, and for a moment, he looked almost otherworldly. I didn't expect to see you tonight, he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. I wasn't sure I'd come, I admitted, stepping closer, but I needed something. Something, he repeated, his lips curving into a faint smile. Or someone. His question lingered in the air, unspoken but understood. My heart raced, and I dropped my gaze, ashamed of the way his presence affected me. I just wanted to talk, I said quietly, to clear my head. Then let's talk, he said, gesturing toward one of the pews. I sat down, my hands clasped tightly in my lap as he joined me, the space between us feeling both too vast and too small. What's troubling you? He asked, his tone softer now, more personal. Everything, I confessed. Greg, my marriage, my faith. I feel like I'm unraveling. You're not unraveling, he said, his voice steady. You're searching. And that's not a bad thing. It's natural to question, to crave connection. His words struck a chord deep within me, and I felt the sting of tears behind my eyes. But what if I'm craving the wrong things? There are no wrong things, he said, his voice low, only truths we're too afraid to confront. I looked up at him then, his face inches from mine, his expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might say something more, something that would tip the fragile balance between us. But instead he reached out, his hand brushing against mine in a gesture so brief and subtle that I almost thought I'd imagined it. You're not alone, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You never have to be. The days that followed were an agonizing blur. Every moment spent at home felt like a hollow echo of the life I used to know, while every thought of Father Anthony felt like a betrayal of the life I had promised to Greg. And yet, I couldn't stay away. On Saturday morning, I found myself back at St. Michael's, cleaning the pews under the guise of volunteering. Father Anthony was there, overseeing the work with his usual calm authority. He moved through the room with an ease that seemed almost practiced, his presence commanding without being overbearing. You've been coming here a lot lately, he said as he approached me, his tone light but probing. "I guess I just feel comfortable here," I replied, not meeting his gaze. "And why is that?" he asked, his eyes studying me intently. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "Because it's quiet, peaceful. Or because it's something more," he pressed, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The question hung in the air, its weight almost suffocating. I felt my cheeks flush, the truth too dangerous to admit. "Maybe," I said finally, my voice trembling. He nodded, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You're searching for something," he said, "and I think you're closer to finding it than you realize." His words sent a shiver down my spine, their meaning as ambiguous as his tone. Was he talking about faith? Or something far more dangerous? That afternoon, he asked me to stay after the other volunteers had left. The request felt both routine and loaded, but I agreed, my curiosity outweighing my caution. As the church emptied, he led me to the alcove near the altar, the same place where we had spoken before. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows bathed the room in a warm, golden light, casting his features in sharp relief. "I've been thinking about our conversations," he said, his tone measured, "and I believe there's more work to be done." "What kind of work?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "Work on understanding yourself," he said, "on letting go of the fear that holds you back." I nodded, though the knot in my stomach warned me I was treading dangerous ground. "How do I do that?" "By trusting me," he said simply. "Completely." There was something in his tone, an authority that left no room for doubt. I nodded again, the weight of his gaze pressing down on me like a physical force. "Then kneel," he said. The command sent a jolt through me, its familiarity both comforting and unsettling. I obeyed without question, lowering myself to the cold marble floor. My hands trembled as I clasped them in front of me, my breath coming in shallow bursts. "Close your eyes," he instructed, his voice low and steady. I did as he asked, the darkness behind my eyelids amplifying the sound of my own heartbeat. "You are here because you seek clarity," he said, his tone soft but firm, "because you want to let go of the things that weigh you down." "Yes," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Then you must surrender," he continued, "to the process, to me." The words sent a shiver down my spine, their meaning as ambiguous as their intent. But in that moment, I didn't care. I was too consumed by the gravity of his presence, the warmth of his voice wrapping around me like a cocoon. For the first time in months, I didn't feel alone, but the price of that solace was a growing sense of unease, a quiet voice in the back of my mind whispering that I was crossing a line I could never uncross. The air in the church felt heavier than usual, as if the weight of my decisions was settling into the very walls. By the time Father Anthony dismissed me that afternoon, I was no longer sure where the line between guidance and something far more dangerous had been drawn, or if it even existed at all. The things he said, the way he looked at me, lingered in my mind like a spark waiting for kindling. Back at home, Greg's presence only magnified the chasm between us. He was in the office again, poring over spreadsheets or emails, his world of deadlines and clients consuming him entirely. I stood in the doorway, watching him for a moment, hoping for some spark of connection, some acknowledgement. But when he finally looked up, It was with a distracted expression that cut straight through me. "Did you need something?" he asked, his tone polite but distant. "No," I replied, my voice small. "Nothing." I retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind me. As the tears began to fall, how had we become this? How had I become this? Someone so desperate for affection that I sought it in places I shouldn't even tread. The following morning, I returned to St. Michael's, hoping that some time spent in quiet reflection would help settle the storm inside me. Instead, I found Father Anthony waiting at the door, his presence both commanding and disarming. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said, his voice soft but edged with something I couldn't quite place. "Wait, wouldn't I?" I asked, my heart pounding as I stepped inside. "Because I thought you might be afraid," I replied, his gaze piercing. "Afraid of what you're feeling, afraid of what it means." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do," he said simply. The silence between us was deafening, the tension crackling like electricity in the air. For a moment, I considered walking away, leaving the church and never looking back. But instead, I found myself standing rooted to the spot, unable to tear my gaze away from him. "Come with me," he said finally, his voice low but firm. He led me to the rectory, a part of the church I had never been to before. The air inside was cool and quiet, the faint scent of incense lingering like a memory. His private quarters were modest, a small desk and bookshelf occupying one corner, a simple cross hanging on the wall above the bed. The intimacy of the space made my chest tighten, the boundaries between us blurring with every passing second. "Sit," he instructed, motioning toward the edge of the bed. I hesitated, the implications of his request swirling in my mind, but I obeyed, lowering myself onto the mattress as he stood in front of me, his expression unreadable. "You're carrying so much," he said, his tone almost reverent. "So much pain, so much doubt. It's no wonder you feel lost." "I don't know how to let it go," I admitted, my voice trembling. "Then let me show you," he said, his hand brushing against mine as he sat beside me. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Close your eyes," he whispered. I obeyed, my breath coming in shallow bursts as his voice wrapped around me like a cloak. "Breathe," he said. "Focus only on this moment. Nothing else matters. No one else matters." The room seemed to close in around us, the world outside fading into obscurity. His presence was overwhelming, his voice a steady anchor pulling me deeper into the moment. "You are stronger than you believe," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "But strength comes from surrender. Do you trust me?" "Yes," I whispered, the word slipping from my lips before I could stop it. "Good," he murmured, his hand settling on my shoulder. The weight of his touch was grounding, yet it carried an intimacy that made my skin tingle. "I need you to kneel," he said, his voice soft but commanding. My eyes snapped open, a flicker of hesitation flashing across my face. "Here?" "Yes," he said simply, his gaze steady. "It's a position of humility, a way to let go of the things that bind you." The room felt impossibly still as I slid off the bed, lowering myself to the floor, my knees pressed against the cool wood and my hands rested lightly on my thighs. He stood above me, his presence towering, his voice the only sound in the room. "Close your eyes," he instructed again, and I complied, my breath shaky. "Repeat after me," he said, his tone steady and sure. "I surrender my doubts and fears." "I surrender my doubts and fears," I echoed, my voice trembling. "I trust in the path laid before me. I trust in the path laid before me." "You are not alone," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You will never be alone again." "You will never be alone again," I repeated, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, the silence was overwhelming, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a physical force. And then I felt his hand on my shoulder again, warm and steady, his touch lingering just a moment too long. "You've made progress today," he said, his voice calm and measured. "But this is only the beginning." I nodded, unable to speak, the gravity of the moment stealing the air from my lungs. As he helped me to my feet, his hand lingered on mine, his touch sending a shiver down my spine. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his voice soft but firm, "and together we'll uncover that strength." As I left the rectory, my mind was a whirlwind of confusion and longing. His words, his touch, his presence, they consumed me, filling the empty spaces inside me that I hadn't even realized existed. But with every step I took away from him, the weight of what had just happened settled over me, suffocating and undeniable. I had crossed a line, and I wasn't sure I could ever go back. The rectory door clicked shut behind me, and I stood in the narrow hallway, my heart racing. Every nerve in my body felt alive, my skin tingling with the memory of his touch. I couldn't shake the weight of his words, their intensity carving deep into my mind. As I walked back through the empty church, the echoes of my footsteps filled the silence, but my thoughts drowned out the sound. What had just happened? Had I misread the moment, or was there something far more deliberate behind his actions? Each step I took away from him felt like both relief and loss, as though I were trying to leave behind a shadow that clung to me. When I reached my car, I gripped the steering wheel tightly, willing my hands to stop shaking. The space around me felt too small, too confining, as though I were still trapped under the weight of his gaze. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath to steady myself. This wasn't just guidance, this wasn't just comfort. Something deeper had passed between us, unspoken but undeniable. And as much as I wanted to rationalize it, I couldn't deny the truth. I didn't want it to end. The days following my last encounter with Father Anthony were suffocating, each moment drenched in an unbearable mix of guilt and longing. I couldn't escape the memory of his voice, the weight of his gaze, the way his touch had lingered just long enough to send a shiver down my spine. It was impossible to deny the truth now. Something had shifted between us, and no amount of rationalizing could undo it. Greg was home that week, but his presence only deepened the void I felt. He spent most of his time in the office, glued to his laptop, and when we did speak, our conversations were shallow and mechanical. I tried to bring up the idea of spending more time together, of reigniting the connection we had lost, but he brushed me off with the same excuses. "Work's just insane right now," he said one evening, barely looking up from his screen. "We'll talk later, okay?" "Sure," I replied, my voice hollow. "Later." But later never came, and I was left sitting alone at the dinner table, staring at his empty plate and wondering how we had ended up like this. The man I had vowed to spend my life with felt like a stranger, and the loneliness that consumed me was a chasm I couldn't seem to cross. That's when I started going back to St. Michael's every day, finding excuses to be there, volunteering to clean the pews, helping organize donations, offering to assist with the church's paperwork. The work was menial and repetitive, but it gave me a reason to be in his presence. Even if we didn't speak, just being near him was enough to dull the ache inside me. But we did speak, more often than not. Father Anthony seemed to sense my need for connection, and he never turned me away. Instead, he welcomed me into his office, offering me tea and a seat across from his desk, as though I were an honored guest. Our conversations began innocently enough, focused on my struggles with faith and my marriage, but they always seemed to drift into murkier territory. "You're too hard on yourself," he said one afternoon, his voice calm and reassuring. "You carry burdens that aren't yours to bear." "I don't know how to let them go," I admitted, my hands twisting in my lap. "Then let me help you," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Trust me, I'll guide you." There was something in the way he said it, something that sent a flicker of warmth through my chest. I wanted to trust him, wanted to believe that he could offer me the solace I so desperately craved. And yet, there was a part of me, a small, cautious part, that knew this was dangerous territory. One afternoon, after the other volunteers had left, Father Anthony asked me to stay behind. The request was casual, almost offhand, but it set my pulse racing nonetheless. We sat in his office, the late afternoon sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. "You've been coming here a lot lately," he said, his tone light but probing. "It's the only place I feel at peace," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his gaze steady. "And why do you think that is?" "I don't know," I said, though it wasn't entirely true. I had 1,000 reasons swirling in my mind, but none of them felt safe to say aloud. "You're searching for something," he continued. "Something you feel you've lost, am I right?" I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I guess so." He leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "It's natural to feel that way. We all crave connection, to be seen, to be understood, but sometimes we look for it in the wrong places." His words landed with a weight that made my stomach twist. Was he talking about Greg? Or was he talking about us? "I don't know what's right or wrong anymore," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I just know that I can't keep feeling like this." "You don't have to," he said softly. "Not if you let me help you." The room felt impossibly small, the air thick with unspoken tension. I wanted to believe him, to let myself sink into the comfort he offered, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. As the weeks went on, my dependency on Father Anthony deepened. Every day I found new reasons to be at the church, new excuses to linger in his presence, and every day our conversations grew more intimate, more charged. He never said anything outright, never crossed the boundaries of propriety, but there was an undercurrent to his words that left me breathless. One evening, after everyone else had gone home, I found myself in the alcove near the altar, kneeling in prayer. The church was silent, the only sound the faint rustle of my breath. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the words of the prayer, but my thoughts kept drifting to him, to the way his voice wrapped around me like a warm blanket, to the way his presence made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. Lost in thought, his voice startled me, and I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his silhouette outlined by the dim light. I didn't hear you come in, I said, my voice shaky. He stepped closer, his footsteps echoing softly against the marble floor. You've been spending a lot of time here lately, he said, his tone gentle. I hope it's helping. It is, I said quickly. It's the only thing that is. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he spoke again. I'm glad. But you should know you're not alone in this. You never have to be. The words sent a shiver through me, their weight heavier than I could bear. For a moment, I thought he might say something more, might finally break the unspoken tension that hung between us. But instead, he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against my shoulder. You're stronger than you think, he said softly, and you're not as lost as you believe. As he walked away, I stayed kneeling, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to call after him, to say something, anything that would break the silence, but the words caught in my throat, and I could only watch as he disappeared into the shadows. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stir within me, a spark of hope, of desire, of something far more dangerous than I was willing to admit. And I knew, deep down, that I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't control. The tension between Father Anthony and me had reached a tipping point. Every interaction now carried an unspoken weight, a sense that something monumental was lingering just beneath the surface. Yet neither of us acknowledged it. It was as if we were playing a dangerous game, daring each other to cross a line we both knew we shouldn't. I had never felt more alive or more terrified. The day began like many others. I told Greg I was heading out to run errands, though he barely looked up from his laptop to acknowledge me. His indifference no longer hurt the way it used to. It had become an expectation, as familiar as the sound of his phone notifications chiming throughout the day. At St. Michael's, the usual bustle of volunteers filled the air. I threw myself into cleaning the pews, organizing hymnals, and folding church bulletins, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind from wandering too far. But it was impossible to ignore his presence. Father Anthony moved through the room with his usual calm authority, his voice gentle as he directed the volunteers. Occasionally, our eyes would meet, and each time my breath would catch, the unspoken tension pulling tighter between us. By mid-afternoon, the church had emptied and only the two of us remained. I was gathering my things to leave when he approached, his footsteps soft against the marble floor. Stay a little longer, he said, his voice low but insistent. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Why? Because I think you need to, he replied, his gaze steady. There's something you're holding back, something you're afraid to face. Let me help you. The words sent a shiver down my spine. I wanted to leave, to escape the intensity of his gaze and the way his presence seemed to envelop me, but I couldn't move. Instead, I nodded, my voice failing me as I followed him toward the small prayer room at the back of the church. The room was quiet and dimly lit, the flicker of a single candle casting shadows across the walls. Father Anthony closed the door behind us, the soft click echoing in the stillness. I stood frozen in the center of the room, my hands trembling as he moved to stand in front of me. "What are you so afraid of?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. "I don't know," I admitted, though the lie tasted bitter on my tongue. I knew exactly what I was afraid of. This, us, the undeniable pull that had taken hold of me and refused to let go. "Yes, you do," he said, stepping closer. His eyes searched mine, his expression unreadable. You're afraid of your own desires, afraid of what they mean. I opened my mouth to protest, but no words came out. Instead, I felt the sting of tears welling in my eyes, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a confession I hadn't meant to make. "It's okay," he said softly, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "It's okay to feel this way." "It's not," I whispered, shaking my head. "It's wrong." "What?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because someone told you it was? Because you've spent your whole life believing that desire is something to be ashamed of?" "It's not just desire," I said, my voice trembling. "It's you." The silence that followed was deafening, the air between us charged with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. For a moment, I thought he might step back, might break the spell that had been building between us. But instead, he reached out, his fingers curling lightly around my wrist. "You're not alone in this," he said, his voice steady. "Whatever you're feeling, you're not alone." Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I turned my face away, ashamed of the way his words made my chest ache. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "Let me guide you," he said, his hand moving to rest gently on my shoulder. "Let me help you find clarity." The room felt impossibly small, the boundaries between us blurring with every passing second. I wanted to pull away, to create distance between us before it was too late, but I couldn't. Instead, I closed my eyes, my breath coming in shallow bursts as I felt him step closer. "Kneel," he said, the command soft but firm. My eyes snapped open, a flicker of hesitation flashing across my face. "What?" "Kneel," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. "It's a position of humility, a way to release the things that weigh you down. Trust me." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. My heart pounded in my chest as I hesitated, torn between the pull of his presence and the warning bells ringing in the back of my mind. But as I looked into his eyes, the weight of his gaze was impossible to resist. Slowly, I lowered myself to my knees, the cold hardness of the floor sending a shiver through me. My hands rested lightly on my thighs, trembling as I tried to steady my breathing. He stood above me, his presence overwhelming, his voice the only sound in the room. "Close your eyes," he instructed. And I obeyed, the darkness behind my eyelids amplifying the pounding of my heart. "You're here because you seek clarity," he said, his tone low and deliberate. "Because you want to let go of the things that hold you back. Isn't that right?" "Yes," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Then trust me," he said. "Surrender to the process." I nodded, the knot in my stomach tightening as his words wrapped around me like a cocoon. I felt his hand settle on my shoulder, the warmth of his touch grounding me even as it sent a wave of unease through my body. "You are not alone," he said, his voice soft but commanding. "And you never will be." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a physical force. I could feel the heat of his presence, the strength of his gaze, and the unspoken tension that had been building between us for weeks. And then, just as suddenly as it began, he stepped back, his hand falling away from my shoulder. "You've made progress today," he said, his voice calm and measured, "but this is only the beginning." As I rose to my feet, my legs shaky and my mind racing, I couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. The gravity of what had just happened was too much to bear. the line between guidance and something far more dangerous now irrevocably blurred. "Thank you," I managed, my voice barely audible. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're stronger than you think," he said softly. "Don't forget that." As I left the prayer room, my thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and longing. Every step I took away from him felt like both a relief and a loss, the weight of his words and his touch lingering long after I had gone. I knew I had crossed a line, one I could never uncross, and yet a part of me didn't want to. The days following that moment in the prayer room were a blur of guilt, longing, and confusion. I avoided the mirror because I couldn't face the person staring back at me. Something had changed between Father Anthony and me. Something that couldn't be undone. The line between guidance and desire was gone, erased in the heat of his words and the weight of his presence. And yet, I couldn't stay away. My trips to St. Michael's became more frequent, each one feeling like both a reprieve and a punishment. I told myself it was for the solace of the church, for the guidance I so desperately needed, but deep down, I knew better. I wasn't seeking clarity anymore. I was seeking him. It was during one of these visits, as I knelt in an empty pew, that the first crack in our secret began to show. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Cole," a voice said behind me. Startled, I turned to see Mrs. Novak, one of the more devout members of the congregation. She was always at the church, organizing events and whispering with other parishioners about whatever scandal was brewing in our small community. "Afternoon," I replied, my voice steady despite the unease prickling at my skin. "You've been here a lot lately," she said, her tone light but probing. "It's good to see someone so committed to their faith." I forced a smile. "It's been a difficult time for me. Being here helps." She nodded, but her sharp eyes lingered on me a moment too long. "Father Anthony seems to think highly of you. He's mentioned your dedication." My stomach flipped, but I managed to keep my expression neutral. "He's been very kind." Her lips curved into a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "He is kind, perhaps a bit too much, don't you think?" The implication hung in the air, sharp and accusing. I wanted to dismiss her, to walk away, but her words rooted me to the spot. She knew, or at least she suspected. Later that evening, I sat at the dinner table with Greg, pushing food around my plate. He barely noticed, too engrossed in his phone to even ask how my day had been. I could feel the weight of Mrs. Novak's words pressing down on me, threatening to choke me. "What's wrong?" Greg asked suddenly, his tone more annoyed than concerned. "Nothing," I lied, shaking my head. "Just tired." He didn't press further, returning to whatever had captured his attention on the screen. I watched him for a moment, the familiar ache of loneliness settling in my chest. How had we become this? A marriage of silence and avoidance. I thought of Father Anthony, of the way he looked at me, spoke to me, made me feel seen. The contrast was stark, and it only deepened the knot of guilt in my stomach. The next day, I returned to St. Michael's, my steps hesitant as I entered the church. Father Anthony was waiting for me in his office, his expression calm but guarded. "Is everything all right?" he asked as I sat down across from him. "I don't know," I admitted, wringing my hands. Someone said something." "Who?" His tone sharpened, his posture stiffening. "Mrs. Novak," I said. She implied She suspects something." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze narrowing. "She doesn't know anything. People like her thrive on gossip. Don't let it get to you." "But what if she's right?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What if we've crossed a line?" "We haven't," he said firmly, though his words carried a weight of uncertainty. "What we've done, what we're doing, isn't wrong." His insistence should have reassured me, but it only deepened my unease. I wanted to believe him, to trust that this connection between us was something pure, something beyond reproach. But the look in his eyes, the tension in his jaw, told me that even he wasn't entirely sure. As the days passed, Mrs. Novak's suspicions seemed to spread like wildfire. The once welcoming faces at St. Michael's grew colder, their smiles tight and their whispers louder. I could feel their eyes on me, judging, accusing, every time I walked through the doors. Father Anthony, too, seemed to change. His calm demeanor was now tinged with something darker, an edge of frustration, of fear. Our once private conversations became tense, our stolen moments filled with an unspoken dread. One evening, as I was leaving the church, he caught my arm, his grip firm but gentle. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. I followed him back to his office, my heart pounding as he closed the door behind us. He turned to face me, his expression troubled. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice strained. "The rumors, the gossip, it's becoming dangerous." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we need to be careful," he replied, "for your sake, for mine. If this gets out—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. The fragile connection we had built was teetering on the edge of collapse, threatened by the weight of secrets and lies. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We lay low, keep our distance, at least for now." The words felt like a punch to the gut, but I nodded, knowing he was right. The walls were closing in, and there was no room left to pretend that this was anything other than what it was, a dangerous, forbidden bond that could destroy us both. That night, I sat alone in my bedroom, the darkness wrapping around me like a shroud. Greg was in the office again, the faint sound of his keyboard clicking, a distant reminder of the life we had built and the cracks that now threatened to tear it apart. I thought of Father Anthony, of the way he had looked at me that afternoon, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Was it regret? Longing? Fear? I didn't know. All I knew was that the connection we had shared, the thing that had made me feel alive for the first time in years, was slipping through my fingers. And as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, I realized that the choice was no longer mine to make. The wheels were already in motion, and the consequences of our actions were coming for us, whether we were ready or not. The confrontation with Greg was inevitable, and when it came, it was devastating. He stood in the kitchen, his face pale, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. I barely recognized him, his calm demeanor replaced with simmering anger. "Did you think I wouldn't find out?" he asked, his voice sharp enough to cut through the air. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Greg, Don't," he interrupted, his voice trembling. "Don't lie to me. Do you even know what it feels like to hear from someone else that your wife is the subject of town gossip? That she's been spending too much time alone with a priest?" "It's not what you think," I whispered, the words falling flat even to my ears. Greg laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and foreign. Then, what is it, Sarah? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've betrayed me. Tears streamed down my face as I struggled to find the words. I didn't mean for this to happen, I said, my voice breaking. I was lonely and I needed someone. You needed him? He asked, his voice rising. What about me, Sarah? I was here. Were you too busy finding solace elsewhere to notice? I tried to explain, but Greg didn't wait to hear it. He grabbed his keys, his movements quick and decisive. I need space, he said, his tone final. I don't know what this means for us, but right now, I can't even look at you. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone in the deafening silence. I sank to the floor, my body shaking with sobs, the full weight of my choices crashing over me. The emptiness Greg left behind was staggering, but it forced me to confront the truths I had been avoiding. I spent days replaying our argument, wondering if there had been a moment where I could have made a different choice. But the reality was clear. I had crossed a line, and the damage couldn't be undone. When I finally returned to St. Michael's, it felt different. The warmth and comfort I once found there had been replaced by a hollow ache, a reminder of all I had lost. The whispers of the congregation were quieter now, but their judgment lingered in the air. Father Anthony's absence was glaring. He had stepped down from his position, the official reason vague but unmistakably tied to our connection. I sat in the back pew, my hands clasped tightly, tears streaming down my face as I prayed for forgiveness, not just from God, but from myself. Weeks turned into months, and I began to rebuild. Greg and I spoke sparingly, his voice distant on the phone as we navigated the legalities of separating our lives. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either, and I couldn't blame him. I had broken something sacred between us, and there was no going back. One day I received a letter from Father Anthony. It was brief, his handwriting neat and deliberate. He apologized for the pain caused, for his part in what had happened, and wished me strength in finding my path forward. His words were both a balm and a wound, a final acknowledgement of the bond we had shared, and the necessity of letting it go. I took steps toward healing, one small act at a time. I started therapy, reconnected with friends, and even found a part-time job that gave me a sense of purpose. The weight of my choices still lingered, but they no longer defined me. In time, I found myself returning to St. Michael's, not for Father Anthony, but for the quiet solace it offered. Sitting in the pew, I prayed not for redemption, but for the strength to move forward. The stained glass windows cast their familiar light across the room, and for the first time in months, I felt the faint stirrings of hope seems to come. Life was far from perfect, but it was mine to rebuild, and as I left the church that day, stepping into the sunlight, I realized I was ready to begin again and again. In the end to my story, my choices shattered my marriage and my sense of self-worth, but they also forced me to confront truths I had long avoided. Though I lost Greg and Father Anthony, I found the strength to rebuild and seek forgiveness, not from others, but from myself. Healing is a journey I've just begun,